And here we are with the last speaker, or last two speakers, but last presentation of the day. My name is Sean Webner, Chief Strategy Officer at Nisos, and I am happy to introduce you to Evelyn and Ian. Evelyn is a Senior Analyst and Tactical Monitoring, and Ian is Director of Intelligence for the Americas at Flashpoint. For those of you who are just joining, please click through and donate to the cause that we're raising money for. The link is on the page right above the streaming view for the talks. We're raising money for Nurses House, National Fund for Nurses in Need. And with that, I would like to hand the reins for the conversation over to Ian.
Hey, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here today. So for this presentation, we wanted to talk about compromised credentials, account takeover, and intelligence-driven password policies. So this presentation will largely focus on some of the observations that we've made from some of the large breaches that have been bought, sold, and traded on a lot of illicit communities online over the last couple of years, as well as I would say, unique insight into some source intelligence databases that we've gained access to, including databases that we've observed being traded. And so what we've done over the last couple of years are attempt to aggregate and normalize a lot of this information to better understand password policies and what type of intelligence we can derive from some of the last breaches that we've observed.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, my name is Evelyn. My pronouns are she, her. My background is primarily military experience. I still think of myself as fairly new to the private sector, but I've been a senior analyst here at Flashpoint for about 2 years now.
And I share a very similar experience, partial military, Navy, partial academic, and of course at Flashpoint. And so to talk through our agenda for today, we're going to be talking about some of the illicit cybercrime communities where threat actors will solicit, share, and sell password information. Now, these are just some sources where we tend to collect from. Of course, it doesn't include all of them. But I will talk through forums, marketplaces, account shops, chat services, and paste sites. I'll start to talk through what makes these communities unique and how that affects our collections, and of course, the information that's being shared within. Then I will talk through the life cycle of passwords, or at least a life cycle as we've observed it. This largely revolves around identifying breaches that typically get combined into combo lists that'll then get validated and go through account checkers. So how this moves through these illicit communities and how that could help us better understand both the supply chains as well as the venues for where these credentials are being bought, sold, or traded. And so I believe Evelyn will then be talking through the economy in terms of the different venues where this software is developed, as well as specialized services like VPS and proxies that are preferred by threat actors, and how the division of labor can become divided amongst threat actors, both to obtain credentials, to check them, to buy them, to sell them, and at times to resell them to different account shops. And lastly, how this is evolving, how credentials are changing, both in terms of how we identify and authenticate ourselves to different platforms, and how that could also help develop other types of fraud.
Yes, apologies. Some of the observations I want to share today are based on our tactical and day-to-day workflows at Flashpoint, following and building profiles on various cyber criminals, leveraging our deep access into various criminal undergrounds, hacker forums in both English as well as other foreign languages. We're going to be looking at the specialization that we see developing in cybercrime economies, as well as how those credentials might be changing in the future.
And so when we think of credentials, of course, that's the most basic way that we authenticate ourselves. Typically, it's been username and password, and that's how we authenticate ourselves for email, for financial services, retail, web applications in general. And that model has deviated in a lot of ways over the last couple of years. In some ways, it's evolved. We changed the way that we authenticate ourselves from just something that you know, like a password or a passphrase, to something you have, like a Acct card, an RSA token, or perhaps a dynamic PIN, like a multi-factor authentication. Now we're starting to include more identifiers that are more specialized to you and harder to replicate. And that can include fingerprints, retinal scans, or some more behavioral traits like stylometry, or how you type. And so passwords are generally a core aspect of how you verify your access when you create accounts. However, for any types of accounts that be created, there's usually methods in place to both verify those accounts and to recover those accounts if you get locked out or forget your PIN. In this instance, there's a lot of accounts that can become daisy chained, where you can use an email to verify yourself across several different platforms. And several platforms use technology like single sign-on, where that single account can be used to validate yourself across several different platforms. Again, typically if other criteria is met, but also there might be more than one means to gain access. And so if those credentials are compromised in any way, that could especially be troubling for an individual or an enterprise.
So usernames and passwords, especially large numbers of them, are some of the most common discussion points on deep and dark web forums, in the hacker underground, in various illicit Telegram channels. And that's really because they are seen as a store of value. There's a number of different actors that will specialize in stealing and harvesting passwords using various methods that almost everybody in the security industry, I would hope, has some awareness of, particularly social engineering, phishing attacks, malware, keyloggers, brute forcing database accounts, etc. And we also note that passwords in application portals are particularly vulnerable. I mean, they've been a form of authentication for decades and decades. And as such, there's a lot of very sophisticated attacks against that particular pattern, particularly dictionary attacks, credential stuffing, brute forcing different portals, as well as playing small variations on a compromised credential to see if maybe a user has reused a password with slight modifications.
And so, again, I'll start by talking through some of the sources. And so this will go through, again, just some of the communities that we're monitoring and some of the threads where individuals are claiming to have access or soliciting access to a number of different data breaches that have been bought, shared, or sold. And so for these next couple of slides, what I basically did was looked at a number of large databases that we've seen traded over the last couple of years, and seeing where individuals are both talking about them and what the volume of those are. So to talk about some of the nuances for forums. As Evelyn mentioned, forums have been around for a long time. And we've been monitoring them, I would say, for the last 10 years or so. And partially because they've been just an enduring source of information for breach databases, combo lists, and password dumps. What this graph is meant to visualize is just how individuals might be, just the volume that they're soliciting, sharing, or just talking about those large databases that I talked about before. You can see noted upticks that usually correlates with when a breach is identified. Generally, there is a large level of interest when individuals find out there might be unused credentials from either a social media website or a technology company or a large retailer that could possibly be used or leveraged for other types of fraud. Additionally, there's several different communities, including fraud, cybercrime, as well as more sophisticated venues where individuals might be willing to use these credentials for different supply chains. For example, to supply different account shops or to resell them to other people. As technology develops, individuals look for more and easier ways to communicate, as well as ones that provide more security through encryption. And so, in that regard, encrypted chat applications have taken off over the last couple of years. I would say both for their ease of use and for the security through those conversations. And we've seen applications like Telegram, QQ, and Discord grow in popularity also just for the convenience. And that you could have a conversation on your cell phone, and so the conversations here are usually much quicker, much shorter, and depending on the venues, the barriers to entry might be a lot lower. Some forums require requirements to enter to validate who you are, what you know, what you can provide or share, and a lot of these encrypted chat channels that may not necessarily be the case, again, depending on the source. Cybercrime markets have been particularly volatile over the last couple of years. We've had large takedowns in 2013 with Silk Road, 2017 with Alphabet and Hansa, and of course recently in 2019 with Wall Street and Silkity. But still, there are a lot of individuals that will advertise leaked databases or access to credentials. Individuals sometimes feel more comfortable buying from a seller that they trust. And of course, if there's an escrow, so there's some recourse if there's an issue with those credentials. Additionally, as individuals look to sell more specialized items, if they can aggregate or differentiate their products to make it easier to use with proxies or brute forcers, that might also help them with selling those products. Additionally, a lot of individuals sell fraud guides are just ways to further monetize these credentials. And of course, that helps that life cycle and that ecosystem of these credentials. And lastly, pay sites. Pay sites in general do not require any passwords or access. So in terms of barriers to entry, these are the lowest form. There's a number of different pay sites that have come up over the last couple of years, and individuals or groups may store or share combo lists here. Again, usernames and passwords. And of course, some of those large databases that I mentioned, they might be here. Of course, the value might be a lot lower than you would find on forums, encrypted chat channels, or even marketplaces. But again, if someone is just getting started and looking for set credentials they could use or compromise, this may be a starting point for them.
So one of the things we wanted to address with today's presentation is the way that our insight into the past breaches that Flashpoint has continued to identify and collect into our own database is that it really allows us to track how threat actors move through this life cycle of a particular credential. First, starting out with when that credential is breached, maybe it's exposed through an SQLI injection attack against a particular retailer. You get a username and password, and that's packaged into a combo list with everything else that that threat actor has breached in the last month. Maybe that's uploaded to a forum, and that's downloaded by so many other threat actors. They run it through various account checkers, which are really programs that are sometimes referred to as brute force, but really what they're designed to do is attempt a number of different credentials against some set of target websites to see where that username and password might also be valid. From there, once a valid account is identified, threat actors will sometimes sell that on to an account shop that will post it for sale, or sometimes a threat actor will simply monetize it themselves. Monetization typically looks like some form of fraud, ordering an iPhone on credit, for example, draining an account balance, using up all of the gift card value on a particular Amazon account, etc. And what we're able to do with the database that we call compromised credentials monitoring of all these past breaches is kind of track a first observed of a particular credential in exposed combination lists. We can track when it's been repackaged. We can track when other threat actors refer to that particular package or particular combo list as played out or not particularly worthwhile, etc. What this database can't really do in this case is identify what the timeline is from when we first observe that breached credential to when it's first used by a given threat actor, so when it's checked. So if your credit card is compromised on a particular site, when is the next time that a threat actor attempts to use that credit card for an illicit purchase? That's one of the questions that's still out there. We're hoping to make a little bit more progress on that. Slide. And supporting this life cycle is a larger underground economy of threat actors. You have threat actors that begin to specialize along different skill sets that are required in that life cycle. So you have threat actors that would like to breach particular sites, harvest credentials, aggregate them, and sell those on as is. That's one particular specialization you might have. Another would be the malicious software developers that are designing checkers and brute force software programs that are attempting to check those combination lists against other sites. That's another type of specialization. And finally, you have different account shops and places where these credentials might be sold on to other threat actors. And that's just another set of skills and characteristics that we'll see in various dark web forums and various hacker communities. What we've been seeing as far as trends and observations is that there's generally a difficulty. They'll frequently discuss frustration with overcoming particular organization countermeasures. Two-factor authentication is very often something that's mentioned. How do I bypass? I can't get past this, etc., etc. We've also noticed that some specializations in particular appear to be moving towards more a software as a service or subscription model for their services. So we've seen threat actors that initially started off providing standalone programs to go check accounts against this particular bank. They're now rolling that into a virtual private server, and they're selling access to that on a weekly basis as almost a, here, rent my account checker, give me $300 and you can have it for a week. You can check as many credentials as you like. Another thing that we're seeing is a sort of vertical integration in this economy. We're seeing threat actors who started off developing software, now they want to sort of expand into selling the accounts themselves. So they no longer want to sell just the account checker. They also want to be capable of selling the validated accounts. So those are some of the trends we're starting to see. Of particular interest is we're also seeing threat actors begin to move towards a subscription for the compromised credentials themselves, for individual breaches. And they're promising a particular number of breached credentials, new, fresh, etc., however they choose to describe them, for a particular monthly fee. It's not really clear whether or not those have lasting staying power, but that's something we're seeing as a new development. One of the other topics that are frequently discussed in hacker forums are usernames and passwords being a starting point for identifying accounts as a store of value. Because there's this idea of meta authentication where various organizations not only want to check the username and password, they also want to check source IP address, they want to check cookie values, they want to see that there's been a history of clicking around on the website, they want to see that user agent, et cetera, all of these things line up with a valid user instead of a common brute force piece of software. So we're seeing threat actors move from username and password to building a more profile-based approach against victim accounts. They want to understand not only the username and password, they also want to see things like the user's name, past addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers, background reports, etc. So we start to see that, in particular, background lookup services start to have a lot of value in these communities. We're also seeing authentication moving beyond just usernames and passwords. Earlier or later last year, we were looking at the possibility that threat actors were using deepfake voices to bypass voice authentication in advance of seeing some of the activity around business email compromise fraud. Next slide. And I'm going to turn it back over to Ian to discuss some of the ways in which this database can be used to inform password policies.
Okay, thank you, Evelyn. So I believe this is our last slide here. So again, just to recap, why is this important for the defender? As defenders, we want to basically create leverage and increase the cost for threat actors to stage these attacks. And the best way we can do that is to understand how our users are both crafting passwords and possibly reusing passwords across platforms. And so going back to Evelyn's point of the life cycle, by looking for first observed passwords, last observed, we can understand how passwords might move through different illicit communities and how they might be both breached as part of a combo list, checked, and then make their way to account shops. And as we can identify these accounts that are continually compromised, we can either update our account policies or craft better policies around how passwords in our enterprise are being created. And so again, it takes continually monitoring and updating our policies and the methods which we authenticate our users, both to ensure that passwords aren't too simple, too common, and often reused, and that we're being thorough in our methods to make sure that there is no illicit use of those passwords across various platforms. And just lastly, threat actors are increasing their ability to stage these attacks at scale. So as defenders, we have to get better about identifying both the communities where these passwords and credentials are continuing to be bought, sold, and shared. And again, how we create policies around the passwords within our enterprise. And so with that, I think we're going to open it up for questions. So that's all we have, but thank you for your time. And I hope that you guys learned something today.